I'm amazed at how much I go back to my articles that I wrote, 5-10 years ago, and I'm just like, man, what a crappy sentence. You should have, that's choppy right there, and you should have combined those two sentences. But it's an art form.
Well, and you've coached, so you get this too. You tend to remember the losses more than the victories, And I've had people all the time say, "Oh, this was a great story. This was that." I go, "Oh yeah, that was a really good story." But all I can remember are the ones that I think, I should have done this or I should have done that, and those are the ones that haunt you. But that may be what makes you successful, is focusing on the ones you could have done better.
Yeah, I was going to start this with, kind of talking about your growing up years, but since we're talking about writing, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, what it means to be a great writer. When I think about sports writing, Dan Jenkins is the guy that kind of comes to mind. I guess he, that article that he wrote for I guess it was the Oklahoma-Nebraska game or something like that. It's just considered one of the greatest articles of all time for Sports Illustrated. But what does it take, in your opinion, to be a great writer and a great sports writer?
Well, that's, and I think great writing doesn't have to be sports writing. I think it can be, all writing has certainly similar characteristics. And, one, it depends on whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but since we're talking sports writing, I think the biggest thing is you've got to be able to tell a story in a way that people want to read it. When I teach writing classes, or speak to writing classes, I always tell the kids, I go, there's only two people I can guarantee you are going to read this story. One's going to be your mom, the other's your teacher. I said, everybody else, you've got to convince them somehow that they need to read it, and usually you've got to do that in the first sentence or the first paragraph, what we call a lead. And that's why I've always admired the guys that you can start reading a story about something you have no interest in, but that first sentence or that first paragraph draws you in and makes you want to keep going with it. And then the second, the more technical part, and I think is, I don't want to be the old man, get out of my yard kind of thing, but I think one of the problems today with a lot of sports writing that I read, they don't really tell you why things happen. They tell you what happened, and they'll give you the quotes to it. But one of the things I enjoyed more than anything, and I think I kind of made my reputation when I was a beat writer back a long time ago, in the last century, is I'd talk to coaches and said, but tell me why this happened. Why was this play there? Or what set this up? Or what did you do during the week that you knew this was going to work? So when people read it, it wasn't just, so-and-so won a game. They won the game because. And I think that's what really gives, if you can't give insight to people in sports, they watched the game. They saw what happened. You don't need to recap that. But at the same time, there are things behind there that led to that great play or that strategy or whatever it was. I had years ago when I first started out, I actually covered North American Soccer League. I was working for a paper over in Atlanta, and they had a franchise there, and I got to see some great players that came through back in this is the late 70s. But anyway, had a soccer coach tell me, he said, well, this team is faster than we are, so we're going to keep the ball on the sideline. We don't want them in the middle of the field. They can outrun us, but if we keep it to the sides, then they have to slow down and play our game. I was young, but that was a real telling moment for me to start thinking about, how do coaches game plan? How do they adjust for what they're getting ready to see? And that's sort of the approach that I took for a long time with sports.
So I know you wrote, long form stuff. You wrote some profiles, but you also wrote opinion. What was your favorite type of writing?
Oh, honestly, I really enjoyed being a columnist because that gave me the freedom to do whatever I want to do. But I've always liked telling people stories. And it's kind of what I do now. We may talk about it, but I'm sort of ghostwriting books for people now. And people say, well, you need to write your own book, your own story. And that doesn't interest me as much as telling your story, and helping somebody else get their story out of what they're doing. And those are the things, as I look back on, that I'm probably the most pleased with was some of the long-form features that I was able to do and tell people stories for them.
What were some of your favorite ones?
goodness, you shouldn't have asked me that. There's so many things over the years. Some were, one story that goes way, way back. But when Gene Jelks sort of turned Alabama in for the allegations that never end up being proven false. But I found Gene Jelks. Nobody else had. He was in Atlanta. Actually, the son of a major Auburn booster was his attorney and put him up in a apartment over there and was supposed to be looking after him in exchange for telling this story, just to be honest. And it was a really kind of an interesting story to have him at that point. He'd felt forgotten, and he was ready to talk about people that had paid him to do these things and how it had kind of ruined his life and really meant where he couldn't come back to Alabama again. And he was a Gadsden kid that really should have been in the NFL, to be honest. But but he blew that as well. Mm-hmm. That was a story I really enjoyed.
Was that kind of a defining moment for you in your writing career?
I don't know defining moments. When I look back at sort of defining moments, and this goes back to something we talked about earlier, I think it was 1989. Alabama went to Jackson, Mississippi, and played Ole Miss. This was Bill Curry and Homer Smith, and I forgot the young man who was the starting quarterback had gotten hurt, and Gary Hollingsworth had to go into the game.
I think it was David Smith was the starting quarterback.
No, David was the year before. He had bad knees, and Dunn,
Jeff Dunn.
Jeff Dunn.
Yeah.
Jeff had gotten hurt. I think this is right. They were down 21-0 in the first quarter, and it looked bad. And all of a sudden, they just blew Ole Miss out of the water, 62-20.
27, I think.
Something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a game where afterwards, Tommy Bowden, who was the receivers coach, and I became very good friends. And he became one of my go-to guys. And he told me, he goes, we'd kind of worked on this shotgun passing offense, and we told Homer, we just got to go with it. You just got to have to go with it. He said, and then they were running double safeties, and it made Lamont Russell, the tight end, was open down the middle all day. And we just exploited that. And it was a really chance to explain the things that had gone in and made that game such a turnaround, how down 21-0, they went, Homer, we just got to go with this offense that, you're afraid to go with, but we're going to do it. And, of course, the rest of the year, they were a record-setting offense that just really lit it up, and really even when they lost the game to Miami in the Sugar Bowl, they scored more points on Miami that year than anybody had. So that sort of gave me the insight to begin to look more behind the scenes at what happened. I think back to, this might have been, I guess was before that, Alabama was playing Penn State at Penn State, if you remember the game. We did this thing in the paper where I had to do a little prediction on the game. This is what's going to happen. At the end of it, I'd said, hey, look for Alabama to block a field goal. If you remember the game, at the very end of it, Penn State sitting on the 1-yard line, should have run it one more time, didn't. Joe Paterno kicks field goal. I think it was Thomas Ray. Rays up, blocks the kick. The coaches came to me afterwards going, how did you know?
You're prophetic.
Yeah, I mean, it was just crazy. I had seen them in practice working on blocking field goals, and they were confident they could do it. The key is they thought they were going to do it from the outside, not from the center push where Thomas Ram was, but I didn't get that technical. And people were coming to me going, how did you know that? Yeah. And then I think it was the next week they go to Georgia, and I said, hey, they're going to block a Georgia punt. They did. And it was just pure.
You're kind of the early Tony Romo,
But it was from watching practices and seeing they really believed, they thought they saw a weakness and they could exploit it. Now that didn't happen all the time, but it just sort of happened back to back that year. And it was just funny because people really started thinking I knew football. Yeah. I didn't know football, but I knew what I was seeing and I knew who to talk to about it.
I don't think the general public really knows how hard it is to write, and it's one thing to write an opinion column and kind of put yourself out there and then have to deal with some of the vitriol that you may get in return. But from a long form standpoint, profile piece standpoint, investigative journalism standpoint, it can be hard and it can be isolating, and you have to put a lot of hours into it. And then again, like we were talking about before we went on, if you have a standard of excellence finding the right word, finding the right phrase, getting the article packaged to be able to deliver. It just takes a lot of work.
It does. And when you're writing the long form, you're also conscious of the people you're writing about. Not that you won't be negative if it calls for that, but you want to be fair. And that often requires calling, we've got a rule, we had a rule in journalism that if one source isn't good enough, it's got to be at least two and preferably three. Long form, you never know what person's going to give you that story that's really kind of defines maybe the person or the topic you're writing about. But it also opens up rabbit trails, and you can get lost going down, and suddenly you think, this is a great story. And then you go back and read it and go, but it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm really trying to say here. And the hardest things, and this as a writer, some of the hardest things are the things you leave out, that you have to take out, that you think, I hate leaving it, but you're bound by length, word length or inches length in a newspaper, the old days. Now with the internet, there's no limit probably. We could have put in all those stories that we had to cut out back then. But it also made it tighter and more readable. I did an interview one time with Tex Cobb, who's an old boxer from back in the 80s, had been a karate champion back before when karate was just starting to get big. But he was a boxer and had made some movies. Spent a whole day with him. Hilarious guy. And I wrote probably a 65-inch story for a newspaper, which is outrageously long. I mean, you need to understand.
What would be the word count on that?
13, I have no idea, but we always did column inches, and 13, 15 inches was a good length. 700 to 1,000 words would be the most. 65 inches was just almost book form. And my editor, who was a great editor, and he even said, it's way too long, but it's so entertaining. We've got to run it. And we used to have this thing in the Post Herald back in the day we called it B8. It was the back page of the sports section. You got the whole page for one story and pictures. It was a great long form way of being able to do stuff. Really kind of set us apart as a newspaper as well in the sports section. So we did run it, and it was just a really fun article of a guy that was just a delight to talk to with just more stories than he could ever tell, and those were the fun ones. Those were the kind of fun things to do.
Do you think you need an angle when you go into a story, or do you think you can look at a person and go, okay, let me find the story in this? If you text Cobb, okay, was there an angle that went into that, or were you thinking, all right, I want to know more about this person, and everybody's got a story to tell, and let me mine for what's important, and then present that to the public?
No, I really think you need to go in with an idea of what you're after. Tex Cobb was actually fighting, had a fight here in Birmingham that he was here and training for and getting ready to do, and I had read some stories about him and had seen some of his movies because he was an actor. But you've also got to be flexible enough that when you're talking to somebody and they give you something you weren't expecting, to pursue that angle, and it may change your story completely. You may go in with one idea, but they give you something that's so good, you can't give that up. If you trip over a gold nugget, you got to pick it up, put it in your pocket, and make it valuable. So that I would say you always need to go in having done your research. You need to go in, this is what I want to talk about, but you've also got to be flexible enough to go, hey, this is somewhere I didn't know we were going, but we need to pursue this.
How has the culture of writing changed across the years? I just feel like that, the 80s and the early 90s, that was kind of the heyday of great sports writing, and particularly in Birmingham. I mean, the Birmingham sports writing culture was very robust. But how has it changed across the years over the last 20, 30 years? And, is it better? Is it worse? What's your opinion about that?
I don't think the writers are any worse. I don't want to criticize any of the writers, but I agree with you in that the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, sports writing came out of that era where oftentimes you were almost too close to the people you were writing about. Coach Bryant, Coach Dye used to have writers over to their house after games, which just blows people's mind. But when I first got in the business, Coach Bryant would still have certain writers come over to his house after a game and sit around and eat, have some drinks, whatever, and you became friends.
Did you do that?
I never got to. I was on the very tail end of that, but Bill Lumpkin, Alf Van Hoos, guys like that were here in Birmingham before I got here, or right when I got here, were very close. And so being critical of Coach Bryant was very difficult. But it also just began to change where we still had that kind of access, but we were not so close that we couldn't criticize when it called for being critical. And I think that made for more honest journalism. And then the writing, there was a guy named John Shulian that used to write in Chicago and Philadelphia that later got into writing TV shows, but I thought he's a guy that I really read and enjoyed. And if you ever get a chance, you ought to look up John Shulian's work. He's got several books of collections. Mitch Albom is another guy that, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Let's bring Sadie in on the conversation. Yeah, that's okay.
Sit down, Sadie.
Sadie and I have completely warmed up. So
she's not supposed to come upstairs, technically, but
we've reached a new level in our relationship.
Yeah.
So.
This is
Let
my
her
dog,
sit.
Sadie.
Yeah, I love it. Let her sit. Let her
Sit down.
sit.
Sit.
Yeah.
Good. Please obey me. Sit, Sadie. Sit down. All right. So anyway, in the 80s and 90s, it really began to sort of change, I think, to where we still had long form and could write things. And newspapers was a great format for me. I mean, for me personally, because I needed that 24-hour deadline. If you give me a deadline, later on in another job I was at, I was working, and somebody said, "Hey, we got to have this in a hurry." And I'm like, "Okay, great. How quick do you need it?" And they said, 2 weeks. I'm like, 2 weeks?
Yeah.
That gives me 13 days to do nothing. You know, I can go to the beach for 13 days because I can get this done in 24 hours.
Yeah.
But then as the internet came in, two things started to happen, I think, that changed. We're talking sports. Coaches began to limit access. They didn't let you have as much freedom. When I was with Coach Stallings in particular, but it also, Ray Perkins was kind of when I first got here. I could go in to the football building, go back, sit down and talk to the coaches. You know, there was a window during the day when they gave us the freedom to do that. We got to know players. And so you really developed relationships. Professional, but you had good relationships. Later on, coaches began to limit, hey, you can't talk to my assistant coaches anymore. You can only talk to these players. Schools began to realize we can create a website and put out our story our way.
They control the narrative.
Yeah, we don't need you anymore.
Okay, but let's go back to that statement, though. You know, why do you feel like that started to change? Why do you feel like, now to me, like the crazy coach era was in the 70s and 80s, and they were nutty, and they were, you know, but then the whole dynamic changed, and now it's like you don't get those locker room interviews, you don't get the behind the scenes stuff. Why do you think that changed?
I think money, as it became more money involved, more concern about what alumni, the big donors would care about what was written. I do think some reporters began to get very negative, and they were looking for the negative story to write. But then also, as the internet came into being, again, you could control the narrative better. You didn't need newspapers to sell tickets anymore. TV also had a part of that as well. And I think now, you know, there's a negativity. It's easy to be negative. Mm-hmm. It's easy to be one of those reporters that criticizes everything, because I think that's our sin nature. Mm-hmm. If you want to get theological, we just sort of look that way.
Yeah.
I think it's
Sadie, sit.
Yeah.
Sit, Sadie.
She's not going to listen to you.
No,
either.
that's okay. Well, I tried.
But it just, I don't know. It's just, I think that's all changed. But I do think the money, I think, has became higher expectations. Coaches got more concerned over, hey, I don't want this story getting out, or this story could hurt my ability to do whatever.
Yeah. I want to go through the coaches at Alabama and just talk about your relationship with them, if you don't mind. Let's start with Perkins.
Yeah, Ray was a really interesting coach. It doesn't get enough credit, I don't think. People don't realize that he kind of started the whole facility war. When he got here, he said, we need a football building. Yeah. We need but we need an indoor football facility. Nobody in the South had an indoor football facility. He'd come with his NFL background. Ray was interesting, though, in that if he could intimidate you, he had no respect for you. One day, just completely because I'm stupid, he said something to me that he was being negative. I thought he was being funny. So I came back to him with a funny line. After that, we got along great.
Was this in a press conference?
It was in an after practice deal where he'd said, if you read your stuff, you'd think everybody here, he'd had some players leave the team.
Yeah.
You'd think everybody's leaving the team. How dare you write that? And I went, they did leave the team. They don't want to be part of, something stupid. Yeah. But after that, we had a great relation, and that got along, and I appreciated Ray, although I was there in the end zone of the Sun Bowl when he said, I'm not going to Tampa Bay, I'll be at Alabama. And of course, his plane landed in Tampa. The rest of the plane landed in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
So,
okay, what about Stallings?
Great. Love Gene Stallings. And we started off rough. He came in here, lost the first 3 games. He had said in a press conference, this team needs to learn how to win. I wrote an article that said, hey, this team won the SEC last year. You as a coach have never had a winning season except at Texas A&M back in 1967. He didn't like that. Called me in his office. We hashed it out. After that, became great friends. Gene is somebody that I think was honest, and I could ask him anything, and he would say, don't ask me that, which I knew meant he didn't want to have to lie to me. Great respect for Gene Stallings. Enjoyed every minute of that, gave me complete access. In fact, when he was going to announce his retirement, they were going to give it to the Birmingham News first because that was the bigger paper, and they published on Sunday, and we didn't. And he said, no, that's not fair to Ray. And I'd always appreciated the fact that he had enough high regard for me to want me to be included in whatever happened.
Let's skip ahead and let me just ask you about Saban.
Nick was a very interesting guy that I really think I enjoyed. I found him, as everybody does, incredibly knowledgeable, very honest. We had a small run-in that I regret to this day. I think it did affect our relationship because I think he remembers things like that. But he was a great. Anything you ask him, he would give you a really good, well-thought-out answer, often go in a direction you weren't expecting, but it was really good. And a lot of people early on, if you remember, Alabama had lost a couple of games, and he was talking about coming back from it and said, after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And I wrote a column, I said, he's not saying it's like Pearl Harbor, but he's saying after something bad happens, how do you respond?
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment because I don't like that when people make something out of nothing. Yeah. He wasn't trying to disrespect, anybody in that statement. And when people take something like that and make an assumption, then make it a bigger deal than it is. Yeah. But tell me about what happened with respect to that deal.
And so I simply said that he wasn't saying this equates to Pearl Harbor. It's just the reaction after the event. He had a number of things like that he said early on that people would took, and I understood why they did it, but it wasn't fair. And again, Nick even, it was embarrassing, but after a post-game press conference, walked down to me and shook my hand and thanked me for having written what I wrote, which is not really what you want as a sports writer at that point, because you look sort of like you've sucked up to the coach. But as I said, toward the end, I said some things to him that I regret that I said. His sports information director actually thanked me, said they needed to be said. But, Nick, and you've watched his personality, when he would do this and cross his legs, you knew that he was unhappy. And after that, he was always cordial to me, but it wasn't the level that it was early on.
Yeah, and I've been in there. I mean, I've been in a press conference, and not to the extent that you have. I mean, I've been in there with Oates, I've been in there with Saban, but from your standpoint, is there an intimidation factor that plays into, and how does that affect somebody that's a more seasoned sports writer like you versus somebody that's younger, like that may be, cutting their teeth, and like, is that a real thing that Saban can intimidate and influence the questions that somebody asks?
He can if you don't know why he's doing it. Nick Saban is great in that everything he says, he has 2 or 3 different motives for it. And what people often didn't see is sometimes a reporter would ask a question and he would appear to fire back at him, dress him down, tell him that was a stupid question, whatever. And then afterwards go up to him and go, hey, that wasn't personal, but you gave me an opportunity to get the message out I wanted to get out. And so, he didn't hold, I always said we kind of held, that he and I had a relationship changed in the end, but he didn't, those things in press conferences, if you were a veteran enough to be able to take that stuff, he knew that, and it didn't work. Fans loved it. They all thought, oh, he's putting reporters in his place. He's not taking this stuff off people. I had people say, how dare you call him Nick? He's coach. And I'd go, he's not my coach. We're roughly the same age. He's Nick, Gene Stallings was that way. And Gene didn't have a problem with me calling him Gene. I never called him by his nicknames or other things. It was always Gene for me, but Beebs, I just thought that was...
You wouldn't call Bear, right? I mean... Did you?
Now there's such an age difference there. Part of that is my upbringing. It's hard, when I did meet Coach Bryant, I probably would have called him Coach. I will say that. But everybody from him on, Ray Perkins on, was usually a first name.
And you were
basis.
younger though then.
Yeah. I mean, he had left Alabama, but Alabama had played Georgia Tech, and I was working over there, and I covered that game. It's a funny story. So I'm going to do a Bear Bryant column. This is this is my first chance. He's a legend. I'm 23 years old, right out of University of Georgia. So we go into this room, and everybody's sitting in these chairs like a press conference. You've been to it. He comes in and sits down in the front, and all the Alabama guys knew what was happening. They rushed to the front to be close to him. So I'm standing in the back. Well, he mumbled. You couldn't hear half of what he said. It was just one of those things. And so I never actually I'm not even sure I was close enough to ask a question. So I don't know that I even got to ask Coach Bryant a question. I got hired to come to Birmingham in January of 1983. I'd been covering the University of Georgia. I get here the week after his funeral. Biggest story in the year, right? And Coach Bryant passes. The funeral was amazing. We all watched it on TV. I get over here. I'm working 2 weeks. Herschel Walker leaves to go to the USFL a year early. I'd been covering Herschel. I missed the second biggest story of the year by changing jobs.
Yeah.
But anyway, Coach Bryant I never really got to meet, but I probably would have referred to him as Coach. And everybody, the older guys called him Bear, the guys that had been to his house and done all that.
Yeah. What was your relationship like with Vince Dooley?
Good. Vince was a great guy to get to know, and was very good to you, very gentlemanly. Years later, I actually had lunch with him one time down on the coast for something else I was doing, and we were laughing about the 82 Sugar Bowl when Pitt beats him for the national championship and some stuff that had happened there. Good guy, really just a really genuinely good guy that you could ask anything of and he'd tell you.
I've been an Alabama fan my whole life. I was an Auburn fan for about a week when I was like 6, I've interviewed Bobby Bowden and R.C. Slocum and different people, Ray Perkins, Bill Curry, and my all-time favorite interview. You're talking about profiles. My all-time favorite is Vince Dooley.
Yeah.
I interviewed him twice, once when he was a consultant at Kennesaw State, and then I went to his house in Athens and had an interview with him for SEC website, Saturday Down South. And man, I just thoroughly enjoyed talking to him. He was a scholar,
yes,
loved history, but there's and let's talk about that for a moment. There was a nostalgia about the 80s and early 90s in the SEC. From your standpoint, what was different about that time? I mean, now the game has changed, and we're going to get to some of those changes here in a minute. But when you look back at that, there was such nostalgia and just the way coaches dressed, and the Jefferson Pilot games, and there was such a rich history that evolved in that era. So from your standpoint, what were the best parts about that?
Yeah, I think again it goes back to relationships. I think it was right when college football, the whole TV landscape changed in the 70s, so it was really starting to get national exposure. So you still had a bit of that old feel, but you also had the new feel coming in, and but you got to know the coaches, you got to know the players, people I'm still friends with to this day, and that went on, and they felt like they still needed newspapers to help sell the program. You didn't have websites and all this other stuff going on, so they treated you as somebody they needed to be with. And again, as I said, you could go to dinner with them. I had lunch with Pat Dye one day. We made tomato sandwiches, which I'm not a big fan of, but that's what he wanted. And so we were sitting at his house, and you got along. You'd see him in the off season, and it was just like two friends running into each other, and you could talk. Didn't have to be about work. And you also had access. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I was at almost every practice. Ray Perkins even had, when he went into 3-a-days at one point, he said, "Yeah, you want to spend the night at my house?" So you're there at the 6. He said, "You won't show up for the 6 a.m. practice." Charles Hollis was the other beat writer. We said, "Oh no, we took that as a dare." Yeah. He said, "Well, then come spend the night at my house. We'll get up and go." So we did. Only did it once.
Yeah.
But but you could do that sort of thing, and it was also where if you wrote something and the coach didn't like it, he'd call you in his office, as I told you with Gene Stallings. You go through it, and in most cases it was over. Some of them it wasn't, but generally, once you hashed it out, you explained your point of view, it was over and done with.
But you got to have some thick skin to do that kind of stuff. I mean, to do that type of writing. And so, from your point, from a philosophical standpoint, I mean, you've got to tell the truth. Obviously, you want to be fair, but how do you decide when to, hey, I'm gonna push this a little bit, and I may be a little critical of this situation, this coach right here,
This is a statement I learned from Raleigh Dotch, who was the Birmingham Stallions coach, that really is what brought me here, was to cover the USFL in 83. He'd coached with Chuck Noll at Pittsburgh Steelers. Chuck Noll said something that I always held to, and to every coach I covered, I told this to. Chuck Noll had said, "If I'm winning, you can't hurt me. If I'm losing, you can't help me." And I always thought that was true. If you're losing games as a coach, no matter how much I like you, you're going to get fired. If you're winning games as a coach, no matter how much I may dislike you, you're not going to get fired, because they want you to win.
From a sports writer standpoint.
Yeah, from a sports writer standpoint. And so that was always my view was, if you're losing games or you're doing things the wrong way or whatever it may have been, my job's to tell people about it. I want you to be able to give me your view on it, and I'm going to be fair with you. But let's understand, there's another side to the story we've got to be told here.
What about being critical of players? What's your philosophy on that? Like, let's say, for instance, I'm writing a column on Alabama basketball or something like that. Do you think it's okay for me to be critical of the way a player's playing?
Of the way they're playing, yes. Now, there are limits to that. I'd hate to call a player a choker, and I've seen guys that did he choked the last shot. Michael Jordan was famous for saying, if you counted how many shots I missed in my career, it's far more than the ones I made. But if a player makes an obvious mistake, it needs to be pointed out. If he read something wrong or reacted wrong to something, then I think that's part of what needs to be said. So, but it was, as I tell people all the time, people say, do you miss being a sports writer? I miss the way it was. I wouldn't want to do it the way it is now. Guys have a tough job now, and they've, and I was on the front end of this whole internet stuff, but I loved the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and I would even now, I would do that again in a heartbeat, because you felt like you were telling people stuff they couldn't get any other way. Yeah. And that's what I think goes back to what we started with. What's good writing? I need to tell you something that you could not know if I wasn't there to tell you about it.
It's giving people access. It's opening a window to people.
And the coolest thing for me ever, and this happened a lot, fortunately, would be run into somebody in a restaurant. You, Alan, so hey, let's talk about this game. And you'd tell me something. You know what I think? I think this. Well, this is something I had written that morning, but it resonated so well with them that they felt like it was their own opinion. And I'd never say, hey, that's really insightful.
But you are controlling the narrative in a certain sense.
And there's a responsibility that comes with that. Yeah.
Who is another guy that might have been a colleague or somebody that wrote for another paper that you really admired their work?
Here in town?
Just anywhere.
Yeah, there were so many really good sports writers that I enjoyed reading their stuff. Dave Kindred for years in Louisville, and then Atlanta was a great one. Of course, I grew up reading Furman Bisher in Atlanta, and that I thought he was in some ways ahead of his time in just how professional and how good he was. I know he's not popular with Alabama fans because of his run-in with Coach Bryant.
But he was a big deal at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, right?
Yeah, and read it all the time. Local guys we were all friends with and liked them. Kevin Skarbinski and I came in at the same time. Paul Feinbaum and I came in at the same time. I like Paul. I don't think Paul would be offended by this. Paul wasn't a good writer. Paul was a good opinionator. He'd give an opinion that ruffled feathers. A lot of people don't understand. We had a headline writer at the time, a guy named R.B. Falstrom, that wrote incendiary headlines to a lot of Paul's columns. The headlines were often more abrasive than the column were, but of course Paul got credit for that. And Paul did it too. I don't want to sell Paul short, but there were. It was a good group of guys that I was really good friends with. Cecil Hurd, of course, in Tuscaloosa.
I was going to mention him.
One of the smartest, most literate. Cecil always had a book with him. Sometimes he took notes in the backs of books, and they weren't books that most people would read. These would be classics, The Heart of Darkness or War and Peace or something. Very, very funny. Loved traveling with Cecil. We had more fun, and all of us traveled together, spent more time together than we do with our own families back in those days. So he was good. A bit of a homer, no question, but he was in Tuscaloosa, and he needed to be. But it was almost like when he got permission to be negative about what was going on, you knew that something serious was going on if he became critical.
All right, well, let's talk about that for a second. So I am interested in that because I have been doing some sports writing for a while, and I've noticed when you have a press pass at an Alabama game, like I feel like there's kind of like a general rule, like if you're an Alabama fan and you're a writer in that environment, you don't cheer. It's very quiet in there.
Yeah.
Like, and I guess, is it that way kind of across the board? Maybe there's some muddled, chatter, but like you don't celebrate in there.
No. Unwritten rule is there's no cheering in the press box. I think somebody wrote a book with that title.
Okay, so, but can you, obviously, like Cecil Hurd was an Alabama fan. Are you a Bama or Georgia fan?
I really grew up an NFL fan.
Okay.
Now that I'm retired, I'm a Georgia fan. Alabama would be second. I'll be honest about it. You can see my David Green jersey here in the background.
But can you just take that angle? Like, you know what? I'm just going to take the homer angle, and I'm going to be the homer, and like that's what I'm going to write about. Like, and I'm talking about just from a general sports writing standpoint. Or do you have to kind of be fair?
Can you do it? Yes. Should you do it? No. I think you owe it to your readers to be honest, and I think you need to be fair, and you need to see what's really going on, and you need to have you need to take the blinders off and be aware of the good and the bad and be able to present that to people. You're not just writing for Alabama fans or Auburn fans.
If you're saying if you're covering.
Yes.
Right. But you could, just generally speaking, take a homer angle and let that be your stick. You know, I mean, I'm going to take this angle. No,
it could, but you wouldn't have a lot of respect. I mean, that's not really professional.
That's fair.
I even one of the things that Gene Stallings was great about was he'd say, before you write it, ask me about it. You're welcome to come to every practice, whatever you see, but don't write it without asking me first. And I understood that. That was a trade-off for being able to go to practice. I mentioned that to a colleague in Jacksonville who covered Florida. Went, you're a homer. You're letting him dictate what you write. No, I wasn't. But I respected him enough to say, hey, I saw this. Before I write this, tell me. And then sometimes he'd go, hey, I don't want you to write it. And if you do, you can't come to practice. Now, if it was a big enough deal, you took that chance. You wrote it anyway. If it was something small, you go, it's not worth the trouble it might cause that hurts me down the road.
You know, one thing I've noticed is kind of an interesting dynamic from a commentating standpoint. I do want to get your opinion about that in a second, but like, if you're a fan and a former player like Greg McElroy or Cole Kubelik or whatever, it seems like sometimes when they try to take that non-biased approach, it does not come off well with the fan base. And so a lot of times, you know, Damian Harris or Greg McElroy or somebody from an Alabama fan standpoint, they may not be the darling anymore, you know, so how does that kind of play out?
No, but I think that's fair. I'm proud to see what Greg has accomplished, McElroy, to be doing major games now, and I think he's really good as a color analyst. I'm always interested when he covers and reports an Alabama game to see how he's going to talk about it or his background with Alabama. But I think you're being paid to do a job, and you're being paid to be as fair and unbiased as you can be. And I think that's important. And yes, I get that Alabama fans or Auburn fans or whoever may feel like, he's turned on us, he shouldn't be saying that. If that's what he thinks, you need to listen to it and consider it. There's something to be said.
Well, it was just interesting because I was talking to an Auburn fan the other day, and they were like, man, he does such a good job. But then in a way, and I'm not saying this to be critical of Greg at all, I'm just making an observation. Like, I mean, and there's Alabama fans that don't like the way some of the things that he said. So it's interesting how that dynamic sort of shifts when people get into commentating.
But you'll also notice that if Greg says something negative about DeBoer right now, a lot of Alabama fans are not happy with DeBoer, and so they're like, you tell him, Greg. If he's winning and Greg says that, it's like, Greg, you're terrible.
Right.
So a lot of it depends on where you are as a fan and what coach how you feel about the coach or the team or the situation you're in.
Now let's talk commentating for just a second, because this was on my question list, and I do want to get your opinion on this. But like, I'm just going to be honest. Like, I love Joe Buck. And a lot of people have been so critical of him because of he's so deadpan. But I just love the way I love, if he's announcing, I'm locked in. Yeah. So for you, who impresses you about the way they approach?
I'm a fan of Joe as well, and I think he and
Smoltz?
No, the quarterback. I'm thinking football.
Herb Street?
No, Joe's teamed with Troy Aikman.
Okay.
I think he sucks up to Troy a little bit, but I do think they're a good team that works together well.
Yeah.
I enjoy the NBC crew with Chris Collinsworth. I think Chris does a really, really good job. Here's the guy. Anyways, very good wide receiver.
Yeah.
People forget that about him.
Yeah.
I think he's fun to listen to. Of course, Tony Romo came in and really upped the game because he brought that awareness to be able to predict what was going to happen next, or, as we said before, explain why something happened the way it did.
Yeah.
And I think that's caused a lot of people to do that. Tom Brady doesn't bring as much insight as I think that people expected him to.
Yeah.
I think he's real careful about that.
Yeah. I think he's gotten better, but he's not at a level that, I mean, and like I love John Smoltz. I mean, I think Smoltz, and I'm a baseball watcher, so I mean, I love, and I think Herb Street does an incredible job. I mean,
I think he's really good, and I think he's one that's able to be honest without offending.
Yeah.
Some people feel like he can be too nice. But I just think he does a good job without being offensive in the way he does it.
Yeah.
I'll go back to Mitch Albom, who I think was a phenomenal sports columnist and began to write novels, used to write for the Detroit Free Press. Was not a negative guy, but told great stories and really revealed people. When it needed to be negative, he could be negative, but he did it in a way that was almost like, you stabbed that guy in the back, but he thanked you for it. You know, I mean, it was a way to do that, and I think Herb Street's a little bit that way.
That's kind of where I want to be with my writing. I mean, I don't like going negative. It's just not my personality.
Yeah.
You know, another guy that I really like is Tom Verducci. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he does an incredible job on MLB Network, but he's also a great writer.
Yeah.
And his ability to do extremely well on camera, but also turn a phrase in his writing has been very, very impressive to me.
Yeah, I do watch sports. Just to be honest, I've begun losing hearing in the last 10 years, so I don't hear as much as I used to from the announcers, but I still love watching the games. And everybody's gone to ESPN for the website, and I do too. Sports Illustrated's still got a really good website. Pat Forty is a really, really good writer of college football, very clever. I've known Pat for years. I encourage people to really go find SI.com and read the 40-yard dash.
Okay.
And it gives you some great insight on college football.
Okay. So your writing has not just been relegated to newspaper columns and things like that, and you've written several books. So let's look. This is kind of your newest effort with Rodney. So tell us a little bit about.
Yeah. So Rodney Orr, who started Tighter and Cider, I'll put the title up, Bigger Than Bama, approached me a couple years ago. I had contracted with another writer, didn't like what he was seeing, and asked me to do it, and we just really clicked. I knew Rodney when he first came to Tuscaloosa to start Tighter and Cider, and it's a really good story of him building the website. It's a great history of Alabama football from the late 80s up till 2010, but his personal story, while he's building this business, his family's fallen apart. His stepson, Brandon Avalos, who doesn't get enough credit for it. I mean, he started and won a couple of games. He was a really good baseball player, got into drugs. His wife became a drug addict, went through rehab. Unfortunately, Rodney's wife, yes, passed away. Brandon recovered and leads a ministry now of drug and alcohol recovery, a faith-based ministry, and doing great. Rodney's family's doing great, but I think I love the story because he's so successful. He was on the front end of the internet, fan sites, one of the best in the country, and yet his family, the sacrifice. Any guy, I think, that builds a business or works can relate to the things, maybe not to the severity of Rodney's story, but it's a really good book he's really honest about all that he dealt with, and I'm really proud of the book.
And it's a faith story too. I mean, he had tremendous conflict in his life, but obviously he has developed a strong faith out of that.
He did, and as he said, his wife had really been the spiritual leader in the home most of the early years, which he was embarrassed about. And toward when they really began to have difficulties, he says he just fell on his knees one night and said, God, I don't know I can't handle this. I mean, my wife's a drug addict, my son's an addict, my daughter's threatening suicide. This is all in the book. I'm not saying anything that isn't there. I don't know what to do. And he began to pray and journal. And I had lunch with Rodney long ago, and he told me, he said, I've just got boxes of my daily journaling that goes back 20 years and answered prayer. And at the end, I think, God really did end up redeeming his story and his life, and he's been a great inspiration to a lot of people as he's gone around and spoken to different groups about how God's restored and cared for his family and all this.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your other books.
Roll Tide Roll, 92 National Championship was my first book.
There's the man right there, Stallings.
Yeah, with Gene, and I think it's, I forgot who it was, Kirk McNair maybe, or Hootie Ingram before he died, or somebody not long ago had told me, I reread that book. I'd forgotten how good that book was. I'm like, well, thank you for that. It was a fun book to read. Chronicles that 92 National Championship season, which really came out of nowhere. They were good, but they weren't expected to be that good. Yeah. It was also the first year of the SEC championship game, and everybody said, oh, this is going to ruin it. If you lose that 13th game, this is back when only 2 teams played for a national championship, that it won't happen. Miami, of course, a heavy favorite. And you remember, I'll never forget when Alabama came up at one point at the Sugar Bowl, and 11 defensive players on the line of scrimmage, and Gino Torretta, I think, was the quarterback, had never seen anybody do that to him.
That was Bill Oliver.
Yeah. And also the other part of that great story is how I think it was Michael Rogers was the linebacker, got hurt the week before went to New Orleans, wasn't going to be able to play, and Bill Oliver had to revamp his whole defensive scheme that week leading up to that game, and just, but you had Curry and Copeland and Sam Shade and Antonio, just a great defense, and David Palmer, who was, for me, pound for pound, inch for inch, the best athlete I've ever seen in my life. Great, fun story to write about, and did okay. And it's fun, when people tell me, hey, or you go to somebody's house and you see it on the bookshelf and in the library. Some libraries still have it, but fun book to write.
Just as an aside, just a thought and question I have, was it a bigger deal in 92 for Alabama to win it, or was it a bigger deal in 2009, in your opinion?
Oh, I think that was the bigger deal in 92, because you had gone through Ray Perkins, Bill Curry. It had been 10 years, 12, 13 years since Alabama had won a national championship. Still, people thought Gene Stallings, Steve Spurrier was lighting it up with a passing offense, and Stallings was caught into this run game and defense first. And it was such a great team, just such a fun team to write about.
It was more out of nowhere than 2009, I feel like. Yeah, I feel, you had that 35-0 game at Florida the year before, and you're sitting there going, okay, we're not going to win a national championship with and I say we. See, that's where I have a hard time. I gotta come out of the Alabama fan, box. But you think, well, with Spurrier in the SEC, you're not going to win a national championship.
And it was just such a great defense, and the characters. Jay Barker, who I think the world of. Jay was a terrible practice player, and people would say, well, why don't you throw the ball more? And Gene told me, he said, because in practice he doesn't complete the passes. I can't build an offensive scheme around a guy that can't complete a pass. And to Jay's credit, though, when the lights came on, Jay played great. And that Georgia game that year, it was Air Jay, But it was just all these sort of different stories about that. And my favorite play of the forever is the receiver at Miami and the Sam Shade stripping the ball.
Oh, yeah, your favorite play, yeah.
Play.
Lamar Thomas.
Lamar Thomas. Yeah. And it didn't count. There was a penalty.
Unbelievable.
But still, I was sitting next to some of the Miami beat writers. They were speechless. Nobody had ever caught him from behind, much less stripped that ball and turned around and ran the other way. Yeah. And it was like the whole season. Nobody ever saw that coming. And that was kind of if I had titled the book, that's what I would have called it, is Nobody Ever Saw It Coming. Because it was a fun year. Yeah. Fun bunch of guys.
All right, you got 2 more here, so tell us about
some of these are, were preseason games. The Post-Herald published, we did a number of these every year, of a preview where they would go season by season for that. So we did a number of those back then. Yeah. And then I've got a book coming out here in the next month, again, that I'm co-writing. Law Lamar is a friend of mine that has a ministry called Friends of Hale County that, quite honestly, back in about 2002, he was plagued by the question, who's responsible for the poor? And it wouldn't leave him until finally he came up with the answer that maybe I'm responsible for the poor. And it's a really neat story of a guy that thought he was going to do one thing in Hale County to help people, realized what he was doing was stupid. He was putting Mount Brook values into Hale County, a really poor, mostly black county, minority county. And it's turned into a 20-year ministry that people don't know about, that he's really gone into 27 counties in the Black Belt, which is poor and rural. People have forgotten about helping schools in rural counties. They're all interested in helping inner city schools. Law has done, and his guys have done a great job of getting in and partnering in a lot of ways. And it'll be out in a couple of weeks, published by Trinity Publishing, and it's called Law of Miracles. And just look for it. I hope it'll be a book that people read. And the great thing about it, to plug it, is it's something anybody could do. The stuff he did isn't, you go, oh, it's exceptional. It just, God put people in front of him, and one thing led to the next thing, and he just kept saying okay and connecting people together, and it could be replicated anywhere.
What a perfect segue into my next thought. I do want to talk about your faith, because I know you're a man of very strong faith. I can just look at your books, here and tell you that you're a reader, you care about your faith. And so I guess this is a question this is the way I'm going to ask it. And why do you believe in Jesus? I know that may be a tough question, and I wanted to ask it that way. I wanted to ask it in a tough way. So if you were trying to explain that to a non-believer, and what would you say?
Well, I would tell you, first of all, if I grew up in a church. My parents became Christians when they were adults, before I was born, but after my older brothers and sisters were born. So I grew up being told this my whole life and believing it. But as I got into college, I began to question, do I really need to believe this or not? Two books that I read. One was Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. The other was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. They almost counter each other. Lewis's belief in why there is a God and why that God is who I believe it to be, and why Jesus Christ, his son, resonated with me. The historical evidence for Jesus as a person, for the way the Bible has come together, those are the intellectual parts. And for me, that was what it took. It took an intellectual argument for me to really be convinced. But then the personal level is where it really counts. If you don't have a relationship where you begin to see Jesus actively in your life, things that most people, it's a coincidence. They aren't coincidences.
Luck or random.
I tell people all the time, do you know why UAB has a level 1 trauma center right here in Birmingham, Alabama? It's because in spring of 2012, my wife was hit by a drunk driver. And they told me if we'd had to take her to a level 1 trauma center that was any farther than 30 minutes, she was dead. So from my perspective, it's no happenstance coincidence that UAB has a level 1 trauma center. Now, it's been there for thousands and thousands of other people too. She walks in, they didn't walk in, they bring her in. The doctor in charge happened to be the woman that was over the entire emergency room. It wasn't, so she was primed to handle it. A surgeon that was there had been trained in the military in the Middle East. He had seen the sort of damage that had been done to her by the coincidence, sure, or God knowing what was needed to be there and seeing that every step of the way. It's impossible for me not to see those things from the perspective of this is not just random stuff. Somebody's there looking after, good or bad. I mean, but even the bad things that have happened, like that injury, which my wife is still recovering from all these years later, but you see the good that comes out of it. And you see what some people mean for evil, as Genesis, Joseph says, what man meant for evil, God meant for good. I see it every day in my life. So I just encourage people to really give it a chance to look at Jesus' words and try to live by them and see if it doesn't make a difference, and understand what his life and death and resurrection can do for you.
You know, I'll be honest with you. I struggle sometimes with, you know, am I doing God's will in my career?
Yeah.
You know, I struggle with that, and because, you know, I love sports. I mean, I grew up watching sports. That's what we did. I play in sports. Then I was a coach for several years, and it's like I just go back to sports, you know. But there's this like almost like internal struggle within me, like, am I doing what God wants me to do?
Yeah.
You know, and so you counsel me a little bit on that. So from your
I'll top you this.
yeah.
All right. My oldest brother has several doctorates. He's a professor of New Testament Greek. He's written commentaries. He's helped translate the Christian Standard Bible. He was involved in the translation of that from Greek to English. Has taught PhD level, THD level candidates all over the world. As I said, written commentaries on New Testament. My other brother is a missionary. Was a missionary. He's retired. My sister was an inner school teacher married to a hospice chaplain. Nothing tougher than being a hospice chaplain. I'm the one kid that went into non-Christian ministry work. So you talk about growing up thinking, what am I doing? Should I be doing this other thing? I had a youth pastor once told me, he said, hey, you ought to try to go into full-time ministry until God leads you out of it. Years later, I met him and I told him, hey, I'm trying. It's not, he goes, I should never have said that. He said, don't go into Christian ministry unless God is leading you into there and you can't do anything else. But I do think that we need Christians who are involved in every industry. We can't isolate ourselves to just Christian work, ministry work. We need to be there to be salt and light, to be influences. And I think that what we do by being there, by being a presence, politics, arts, mechanics in garages, who doesn't want an honest car mechanic, you know? And hopefully that's his faith base that's having him do that. I think it's important that we are that salt and light, that we're out there in the world, and maybe we're not overtly witnessing to people or leading people to Christ in the way we would like to and wish we could, but maybe the influence is there and people see a different attitude of not being negative, of maybe trying to tell those good stories. I've had people tell me, and this sounds self-serving, but I've had people tell me, I knew you were a Christian by the way you write, the way you did it. I've had guys tell me, hey, you know what, you gave me some advice. It was a sports writer, and as you know, in sports writing, the rates of marriage success are not real high, particularly back we traveled so much. And I had a guy tell me, he said, the fact that I knew you went home every night, even though you could have stayed somewhere else to be with your family, that made me realize I need to get out of this business because it's costing me my family. I need to be at home. You don't know. Mm-hmm. And I think most of us don't know what the impact of our lives will be until we're in heaven. And some of us are going to be shocked, both good and bad. But I think in your case, you just pursue what you're doing with an excellence, with a desire to honor God with what you're doing and how you're doing it, and trust that in ways you can't see, it's working.
Mm-hmm. Well, man, this has been awesome, and I know we've run long here, but I knew we were going to, and it was so good to interview you and Sadie today.
Yeah, I'm sorry about Sadie, but she's part of me now. She's my dog. So this is fun, Al. It was great. I appreciate you having the interest in including me in your podcast.
Yeah, well, let's do it again sometime.
Okay, absolutely.
All right, man. Thank you.